Good evening. I'm Noel Lateef, President of the Foreign Policy Association, and I am delighted to welcome Caroline Freund, Dean of the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy, GPS, and one of the world's leading experts on international trade and economic development. Throughout her distinguished career, Dean Freund has helped shape how we understand the forces driving growth and inequality in a rapidly changing world. Before joining UC San Diego, Dean Freund served as Global Director of Trade, Investment, and Competitiveness at the World Bank, following earlier positions as Chief Economist for the Middle East and North Africa, and nearly a decade in the bank's International Trade Unit. She has also served as a Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and she began her career in the International Finance Division of the Federal Reserve Board with a visiting year at the IMF. Dean Freund is the author of numerous publications and was co-director of the World Bank's flagship World Development Report 2020 on global value chains. Her research has deepened global understanding of how trade shapes opportunity, resilience, and development. It's an honor to welcome a scholar and leader whose work bridges rigorous analysis and real-world impact. Dean Caroline Freund.
Thanks, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I love New York. I did my PhD at Columbia, so it's always fun to come back. There's a certain smell in the fall that just, brings me back. So I'm going to talk about trade today, and I'm going to start by going back to where this all kind of started. In Trump 1.0. So Trump 1.0 was the first really fundamental shift in trade policy we saw in the US, and it was very focused on China. So China, there were two things that happened. One, and there was an economics literature that was developed around this time showing that small towns in the Midwest and the Rust Belt that were manufacturing were really getting decimated by cheaper imports from China. So there were other things too that hurt manufacturing in the US. There was, huge productivity and technology changes that led companies to be more efficient and need fewer workers. There was also changes in demand. So, one company that went out of business produced projection screen TVs, and nobody wanted those anymore. So it wasn't just trade, but in particular, the sudden and large rise in imports from China really did have an effect. And while we know very well that trade has distributional consequences, what was less clear is how long it takes for those towns to recover, some of which still have not recovered. So one side was what's on your left side, which is just showing kind of the burnout in manufacturing in the US. Then the other thing that happened in 2015 was China's Made in China 2025 report, where China basically said it's going to take over all the strategic technologies of the future. And it was one thing for China to grow in manufacturing of textiles and furniture and things like that, but it was quite another at this point in time to already say China was going to lead in semiconductors, in aerospace, in batteries, in EVs, et cetera. And that put a chill in Washington. And already under the Obama administration, there was a lot of concern about China. But when Trump came in, he really fundamentally changed the policy in terms of tariffs. And this just shows what happened over that period to imports from China. So you can see China joins the WTO in 2001, and imports just surge from China, which leads to this kind of devastation of manufacturing, and then concerns about what that means for the industries that the US is big in going forward. But in addition, we also see we didn't have the same thing happening in reverse. So US exports to China were not going up. Now, if trade had been more balanced during this period, there probably would have been jobs created in industries that export to China that people could have moved to. But that was not the case. There was this big deficit that was created. A large part, and you can look at it here, it's bilateral, but you can also look at it overall, where the US is the biggest deficit country in the world, and China became the biggest surplus country in the world. And so that led to the tariffs that Trump put on. And so this is Trump 1.0, the tariffs put in place. And at the time, people thought this was really different. So you think about what's going on now. Even then, we were very, very concerned because the level of these tariffs were so high. About 25%, most of them, and on about 60% of imports from China. So suddenly tariffs went from below 5% up to 20% on Chinese goods. What's going to happen? Well, what ended up happening is decoupling. So China's share of US imports declined. So in 2017, before those tariffs were put on, China's share was 22%. There were almost a quarter of US imports were coming from China. By 2023, it was down to 14%. That's an 8 percentage point decline in the import share from China. It is really huge. What took 10 years to go up came down in just a few years. Other countries benefited from this, including Mexico, Vietnam, Taiwan, Canada, and others. But it was a policy that was focused on China, and we did see decoupling, but other countries weren't tariffed, so they could replace China. This current trade policy, Trump 2.0, is completely different. What's been so shocking is that Trump is targeting everyone. If you have a deficit with the US, if the US has a trade deficit with you, you are on that original list. Even if you didn't have one, there's an overall 10% tariff. Then there's other tariffs on steel and other types of products. So everybody's being hit sort of right and left with these tariffs. And this is really, really taking us back. So we have not, this shows tariffs over the long history. And you can see that since the Second World War, we have not seen tariffs this high in the US. The US was really the leader in the global world for multilateralism and low tariffs. And then if you look over here, you can see the April tariffs that were announced and led the market to decline suddenly, bond yields to go up, and Trump pulled back. And people talked about, you know, Trump always chickens out, but he didn't really chicken out. The tariffs are still incredibly high compared to where we started and around what he said they were going to be during the election. So he threatened something much higher in April, but he did actually raise tariffs really, really high overall. So why is he doing this? And there's always been a rationale for tariffs, but Trump's team have added some new ideas to why we might want to have tariffs, and some actually go against each other. So they're a little bit contradictory at times, and they fall on whichever one they appreciate at that moment. So the first reason historically that countries have had tariffs is to raise revenue. So especially for developing countries still today, or the US back when we saw tariffs were really high in the 19th century, when it's hard to do income tax, it's hard to do state level taxes, the one place it's easy to tax is at the border when stuff is coming in. So tariffs are a great way for countries to raise revenue when they don't have other sources. That's why developing countries tend to have higher tariffs. But this can't be the main reason, because before these tariffs, they were about 2%, less than 2% of total federal revenues. Now they're up to a likely 4%, but income taxes are 50%. So this isn't going to replace that kind of base. Reshoring manufacturing is another reason. A problem with this is that in a world of global supply chains, when companies can't get imported parts and components that they need, it's hard to compete globally. So we see this especially with the car industry that is complaining that the tariffs on steel, aluminum, electronics are so high, it's actually harder for them to compete now with others than it would be without these tariffs. Tariffs are also put to retaliate for bad behavior. So, of course, sanctions on Russia or other bad actors, that's a typical thing. And that was part of Trump 1.0. China wasn't competing fairly, we're going to tariff them. But it doesn't explain why we'd want to tariff all of our allies. The new focus that Trump has had has really been the trade deficit. He really believes tariffs are a way to reduce the trade deficit. It can work bilaterally, because if I put a tariff on China, I import less from China, I import more from others, so my trade deficit with China will go down. It doesn't work for the aggregate deficit, because the aggregate deficit is determined by how much we produce and how much we consume and invest. So just like in your home budget, if you spend more than you earn, you're going to have a deficit if you buy things. And unless you start consuming less, so unless these tariffs really lead us to consume less, that deficit is not going to go away. And we saw even with the China tariffs in the first term, the trade deficit continued to grow. So they did not work to reduce the overall aggregate deficit. So this is going to be a problem, and it could be a problem going forward if, when the deficit doesn't go down, the administration thinks tariffs aren't high enough. The only time that's really going to work is if they're prohibitive, then of course there'll be no deficit, but the tariffs themselves are very unlikely to change this. The really new thing that was added this time was that the tariffs are there to reimburse the U.S. for what the U.S. does for the rest of the world. So the U.S. is the police of the world. It spends more on the military than the next 9 countries combined. So that's one side of it. And certainly there are countries that have not retaliated because they worry about U.S. and security and want to maintain that relationship, whether you think about Europe or Japan or Korea. The military spending, the military might of the U.S. is very likely one reason countries are being willing to absorb these these tariffs. So because we're spending this much, other countries deserve to pay a tax for it. Similarly, the other argument the administration has given is that the dollar is the world's currency. We're providing liquidity to the world. That makes the dollar overvalued, which hurts our exports. So you should be willing to pay a tax to have access to our market. So these are two new reasons that they've sort of put forward on having this type of trade policy. I'm not saying these are good reasons. I don't think they are, and I think there's a lot of reasons. I mean, trade is good for productivity, for growth, but this is one of their arguments why it's good. One thing you hear often is the big danger about China is that they've become the world's supplier of so many things, and they know it. So you saw just this week on rare earths that if they hold those back, they are by far the world's biggest producer, and therefore it hurts the rest of the world for producing things like semiconductors and batteries and such. So this idea that we have to diversify away from China because everyone's just too dependent. China is 15% of global exports. But the US has a similar monopoly power. The US is 15% of global imports. And it might seem, well, that's demand, so why is that as important as supply? It is very much as important because you want your firms to be able to sell. And how easy is it to diversify away from the US? The US consumer consumes like no one else. And so it's actually very hard to shift away from the US consumer. And economic theory shows that if you have that kind of monopoly power, if you place a tariff, then companies have a hard time finding elsewhere to sell. So to maintain their market, they actually lower prices, which will also lower the tariff burden. So it's likely foreign companies will actually pay, and it's already been shown in some industry, pay some of that tariff. It's still not a good reason to have a tariff, because if the countries retaliate, which is what's happened historically, everybody will be worse off. That's what I was most worried about when Liberation Day tariffs were announced, was the retaliation. And I actually was at a conference in Japan with policymakers from all over the world and academics, and the representative from the EU said, we're definitely going to respond. We have to, politically, for domestic reasons. There's no way we can't. Chinese representative said the same thing. But ultimately, it's only been China who actually has really retaliated. So one of the reasons the tariffs haven't been as devastating as we worried about, well, the first is they're not as high as we thought they'd be in April. And the second is that there hasn't been retaliation. In fact, there's been deals and deals and more deals. So they're not really trade agreements because they're not very detailed. Trade agreements tend to be like 700 pages, and these things are just a few pages. But there have been deals so that tariffs are now at different levels across countries. And this is problematic because it leads to diversion. And although Canada and Mexico set a deal for 25%, really they're the biggest winners because everything that goes through the USMCA is still at zero. So a lot of trade is shifting now to Mexico and Canada. Japan and Korea and EU came off pretty well with the 15%. And there's just so many distortions now because the 15% applies to autos, but the auto industry in the US is paying 25% on parts and on steel, so how does it compete? So there's all sorts of distortions from this varied level, but what's been most surprising is how very little retaliation there has been. So what does this mean for the multilateral trade system? This has really put the multilateral trade system under incredible stress because the WTO, the thing it had been most effective at in recent history is maintaining rules, a rules-based system. It had already been under significant stress even before Trump came in. So in the old days, before the WTO was established in 1995, the main thing we looked to the GATT, which preceded the WTO, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was for rounds of trade negotiation where countries exchange offers and we all reduce tariffs. So this was the kind of function everybody really focused on, is this reducing protectionism, improving resource allocation and competitiveness, and making the world more productive. In 1995, the WTO was formed, and some years later, China joined in 2001 with the idea that China would grow, liberalize, and become a market economy, and then it would also democratize. Well, that didn't happen, which led to strains between the US and China. But there were also strains because the WTO had gotten so big over this period to over 100 countries. It's really hard to negotiate with that many folks in the room and with really different interests. And the developing countries, somewhat rightly, felt they had been left out of negotiations. The next round, the Doha round, was supposed to be to remedy that and liberalize things they cared about, like agriculture and apparel and such. It went on forever and ever, and it ended up just dying. The agreement never happened, in part because China identified as a developing country, but in part also just because agreements couldn't be reached around these thorny topics. So then the big function of the WTO was really about just holding the rules, holding the fort down. And people considered it a really big success in the global financial crisis. When global demand fell, the normal reaction of countries is to raise tariffs to hold demand for yourself. So any demand that's in the country for products goes to domestically made products and supports your firms. So it's really typical in times of crisis for countries to raise tariffs. The WTO was very successful, and the G7, in not having anyone really abuse the system. But then along came the Trump tariffs in the first term, and now the second term tariffs have been really gone against WTO rules because they're relying on a security exception, which was always considered kind of the nuclear option, both because it's about security, but also because once countries started doing this, how do you get out of it? Everyone can do it. Everything can be security, and the whole system falls apart. And so that's what we've seen is now the appellate body doesn't have a quorum anymore, so it's not enforcing any kind of rules. And Trump has opened this security exception. Fortunately, other countries haven't been following. So I would still say that geopolitical rivalry, more than anything else, is what's bringing down the system. The institutions that we have, the multilateral institutions, were developed in a different period for a different world. And now we're in a period with two huge rivals, the US and China, and our system with very different types of economies, and our system isn't ready for that. So if you look here, the UK was originally the kind of country that led the trade system. And they led the trade system when they were the biggest trader in the world. And they were the ones who encouraged MFN, where whatever tariff you give to to parties of an agreement, you give everyone the same, so there's not discrimination. They were the defenders of the global system. When their trade share fell kind of below 10%, the US became the defender as the largest trader of the global trade system. But now we're in a period where it's China's turn. China's really the one rising, but I don't think anyone's ready to turn over the rules to China, and China hasn't been really ready to take that step either. While it's defended the rules in speeches, actions and speech haven't always matched up. China likes the rules we have. China's done very well with the rules in the world, but they're not working anymore, and we probably need to rethink. People have known this for a long time, that subsidies and new industries were going to break the system, but unfortunately there wasn't enough will to really act. So what happens now? One thing you hear a lot about is global fragmentation. So the world's kind of fragmenting into different regions. While I think this is possible, you don't see it yet in the data. So North America trade, or intra-European trade, or intra-Asian trade has been really pretty flat. So while I think this can happen, and we have seen in recent years more imports coming from Mexico, and now they have even bigger preferences, I think it will happen to some extent. It has not happened really yet. And this isn't because global trade is declining. There was a period after the global financial crisis of very stagnant trade. The Economist had a cover, Slowbalization. So everybody was talking about trade growing really slowly in this period. But actually, COVID led to a huge surge in trade because people shifted away from services. They weren't going out to dinner, they weren't going to movies, they weren't going to the gym. Instead, they were buying nice foods, better cooking equipment, a more comfortable chair, more electronics. So they were shifting to goods, and that led to a huge bump in trade, which has really continued. And even this year to date, the WTO and IMF just sort of upped their estimates of what trade's gonna be, because we haven't seen a big decline in global trade. And the last thing I want to talk about is just the dollar. So there's been a lot of talk about the renminbi or some other currency taking over from the dollar. And the problem is there just really isn't a good alternative. And the dollar still rules. So we are seeing a shift away towards gold in reserve assets, but the dollar's still about 60%. The dollar is still used for 70% of trade transactions. So even when trade is between two non-dollar countries, like Europe and China, it's often denominated in dollars, invoiced in dollars, just because everybody understands dollars. And it's really hard to move away from a currency that everybody's used to. Just like it's hard to move away from the English language as kind of the global language, because you'd have to learn something else. Everybody knows what a dollar is. It has a value. It's stable. It's liquid. The capital account is open, so money can come in and out. It's accepted. If the Chinese renminbi were to be the currency, then they would have to let money go in and out easily, and it would have to be flexible, which it's just not. So there's really no alternative. On that Liberation Day, we also saw a bit of shift into euro, but you can shift at the margin. Shifting in a big way is really, really hard. So I think there will be some reduction, and the dollar will probably continue to slide as a result, but it's not the case that it can suddenly change. So, and this is the final thing, what happens next? My guess is there's a fragile path forward where there's market discipline on really extreme changes. So we see this going on right now with the US and China in the news every day about whether or not they're gonna have a deal, whether US is gonna put 100% tariffs on top of all the tariffs we already have on China. The problem with trying to do that is as soon as that gets announced, the market tanks, bond yields go up, and bond yields go up means that the debt is even more expensive for us. So I just think there's kind of a limit on our side to what can be done. And on the Chinese side, their economy is also struggling. They don't have the consumption they need for their production. They have an aging society. They have a property crisis. So they also need us. And so I think it's not in China's interest to have a really big deal, but it's not in the US's interest to have no deal. So we're gonna keep seeing these kind of partial deals, like TikTok here, a little bit of agreement here, and just calming down, but nothing big. So we'll continue to have decoupling, but it will be gradual. And we'll continue to have increased but slow regional fragmentation, because that also takes time, as now there are these big preferences towards Mexico and Canada, and everyone's looking to sort of shorten supply chains. There are huge risks to this, though. We could have spiraling protection. Countries could face political domestic pressures that make them have to start responding to the US. There's all these me first industrial policies, whether on semiconductors or EVs, that could also spiral and bankrupt countries. We could see a really big financial crisis here or elsewhere. And then there's the whole critical minerals. What I didn't mention, I just kept it to the economic risks. There's also, of course, the political risks, the biggest one probably being Taiwan. And something happens there, and everything really changes from that point on. So that's what I had. I'll stop here so we have lots of time for questions and discussion.
Does anyone have any questions for our speaker? Oh, yeah, sure.
Thank you. Hi, Caroline. It's good to see you. Thank you for joining us tonight. This was fantastic, even for people that don't really follow trade flows. Going back to how you broke it down early in the beginning of your presentation, when you look at all the headlines around trade and the so-called trade war, we have a midterm election coming up in just about a year. How do you think this is going to play out in terms of the midterms here domestically? Because by many accounts, if not all, you don't have to be a policy wonk, the demographic that ushered in this administration is being crippled. The farmers aside, it's everything from agriculture in California to rural areas in upstate New York and up and down the East Coast. I don't know, I'm not in Washington, I don't know what the administration is thinking about this demographic, but I'm interested in your perspective on how this could end, if at all, next November and leading into 2028.
Yeah, let me talk to the trade side of that, because you're absolutely right, and I think that's part of course, what's going on with the healthcare debate in Washington right now. And there's even a debate which side the Democrats should take on that to have better outcomes in the midterms. But if we stick to the trade part of that, it's really about inflation. And how much are these tariffs going to raise prices? And they are going to raise prices, but probably not as much as some people have suggested. So there's a Yale budget lab that suggests they'll lead to 2 percentage points increase in prices, which just doesn't make sense to me. Imports are 11% of consumption. So it's most of the money you spend is actually on services. Most of the money, and on food, most food is not imported. It's a lower import share than other types of goods. So I do think the tariffs will lead to some price increases, but they'll be small. I have followed since April prices of the top selling goods on Amazon, and they haven't gone up at all. And on some big products like cars, we have seen the producers taking part of the tariffs. So it really depends how big a problem that is. Now, what feeds into what you asked is the people who are going to be most hurt are actually Trump's demographic. So or part of his demographic. Lower income folks spend more of their income on consumption because they're not savings, and I mean there's a very, the large portion of the country that doesn't have any savings. And those increases in goods will affect precisely that demographic. So I think it'll feed in, but I think other issues like healthcare will be much bigger. And then the other thing I would say on inflation that's been surprising is the services inflation is actually running hotter than goods inflation right now. And it's hard to understand that if tariffs are the biggest thing we have to be concerned about inflation.
We have a question from the Zoom chat, and thank you for submitting your questions. You can use the chat feature. You mentioned how the tariffs will lead to a lot more regional type trade agreements, and just the question is, would something similar to the formerly proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership happen, but with China in the lead, and could that effectively kick the United States out of the Asian market?
Yeah, that's a good question. So China already has such an agreement, the RCEP, Regional Cooperation and Economic Partnership, or something like that. But it's not a very deep agreement. And so and China wants to join the CPTPP. That could actually be the thing that gets the U.S. to go back into the CPTPP. So I do think these regional agreements will continue to develop. Even actually in the recent period, Africa has formed their own regional agreement. So we are seeing a deepening of regional agreements around the world, which will feed into this kind of regionalization. I think the big threat to the U.S. is if the U.S. is left out. What maybe could happen now is at some point back in, I don't know, 2015, we were still talking about a transatlantic trade and investment partnership, so US and Europe. And in my mind, the best way to counter China is exactly that, to have really deep, really strong trade agreements with our allies that set the rules for what we want. Because it may be that China's the biggest trader in the world, but if we couple with Europe and we couple with Japan and we couple with Korea, we all come together, we are much bigger than China. So the best way forward to me would be kind of US trade agreements with our allies. A big danger is actually US is left out of all that. But it's kind of too early to tell now.
You mentioned that China is starting to diversify its exports to deal with the lost exports to the U.S. To what extent do you think this diversification will really lead to dumping of Chinese products in various markets, such as in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that are happening. So when China was the only country targeted, one thing is some of that diversification was artificial because it was transshipment. So goods were going to Vietnam and then coming here, or going to other countries and coming here. So, you know, that was probably maybe a percentage point of that 8 percentage point decline. Actually, some of those countries were transshipping goods. The new regime puts a bit more of dampers on that. Actually, Rebecca was just telling me how she had to pay tariffs on goods from Iceland because actually they came from China through Iceland. So, the administration's new policies are really trying to clamp down on where exactly the goods are originating from. But the other thing is exactly this, that China's looking for other markets and dumping products on the world. And Europe's clearly very afraid about that. Canada is, Mexico is to some extent, and the US is pushing them to do it. So especially around EVs, the countries that have car industries, I mean, US has completely prohibited the Chinese EVs from coming into this country. But that's not the case in Europe or Japan. And they're starting to push back. So yeah, the dumping is happening and transshipment is still happening to some extent.
Thank you. My question is kind of two-part, addressing the US dollar dominance. So you were saying that the risk is fragmentation, regional trade, increase of regional trade. So I was wondering, if Asia is trading within Asia, it's probably better to do it with one of the Asian dominant currency. And one example I could give is India was buying Russian oil, but it paid in Chinese currency, not the US dollar. And again, when you do North American trade, you're better off doing US dollar or Canadian dollar, one of those. And you also said the decline of multilateralism and US's disinterest in joining, I don't know, IMF or the functioning of the UN and other things. Do you think that the US dollar would still be dominant?
Well, I think history really matters. And so the fact that the US dollar is the currency right now means it's hard to change that. So I think if we could start from scratch, I'm not sure that would be where we ended up. But it really matters. Everybody has a view of the dollar. And while I do think we'll see more trade transactions being invoiced in other currencies, and China's certainly pushing that, and even some stable coin can come in for that, et cetera. For reserves, it's a lot harder because you'd have to be willing to have a very liquid currency and bond market that and where capital can flow in and out. And there's just nothing the size of the US financial market. So that's where I think it would take quite some time for something to replace the dollar. But you're right that it will on transactions, especially between China, Russia, and countries in Asia. I think it will start to be replaced to some extent. And on multilateralism, the U.S. just clearly realizes it has more power, or this administration, working bilaterally. And I think it's really unfortunate because it's very short-run thinking, because you're not setting the rules for the future. You're not creating the environment you want for the future. You're extracting everything you can right now. But I just don't see any effort, or even actually from the Biden administration with respect to the WTO, to actually do anything constructive there.
So ever since 80s, when I was going to school, the mantra for world trade was MFN. For 40 years, we have been repeating that mantra. So what is the mantra of the future?
Yeah. I don't know. So I think that's really an open question. So the reason MFN is so good, and it's good for the country that is setting tariffs, is because there's no discrimination. And so if the U.S. stops importing cheaper goods from China and replaces them with more expensive goods from Mexico that aren't tariffed, it's a loss for the U.S. It's a loss because even if it could spend less on the same amount of goods, if there was any small tariff on China that was the same on both, it would also get the tariff revenue. But now it's not getting the tariff revenue, and it's getting fewer goods. So, so that trade diversion is actually costly to the importing country, and that's why trade diversion encouraged countries to really support MFN. I think the extent of trade diversion, if we continue with these various different tariffs on all parties, that could lead to a realization that that's costly, and then a return to MFN. Has it happened over and over and over again historically, where tariffs have gone up and then the MFN comes back, maybe at a higher level, maybe with more flexibility, but I think there's still a space to get back there, but I'm not sure when that will happen.
Hi. I wonder about two things that aren't clearly trade, but they're floating in the same pond and balancing it, or maybe in the future, and that is the terrific effort that was made, is being made, to my understanding, China controlling critical minerals and also some other critical products that aren't mineral. And secondly, the control of key transport spots. So China has acquired enormous control of transport through controlling ports. Mm-hmm. And that is maybe not exactly part of the trade agreements right now, but if you have monopolies or major control of those sources, you can change, it becomes a multiple dynamic that has to be considered as one sort of equation. So I'm wondering, how is that, am I reaching too far into the future, no, or how is that balancing, or could help balance the situation out?
Well, I think it's both causing the situation and helping to balance it. So it's causing it because that's exactly why under Obama, under Trump 1.0, under Biden, where the tariffs remained in place and new restrictions on China were put in place, very targeted ones, this recognition that China controls too much of really important minerals, with the Belt and Road Initiative, started having too many ports, too many, I mean, a lot of the resources aren't even in China. There are cobalt resources in Africa and in Latin America and in other places. So this recognition that we were just too reliant on China. So these policies are a direct response to that. But they also limit it because what China has clearly recognized with the way she's playing now is, okay, you're not going to send me the latest computer chips, and you're not going to, and you're going to put tariffs on me. Well, I'm not going to give you rare earths. You're going to tax Chinese flagged ships at your ports. Well, I'm going to tax U.S. ships at mine. So China realizes it has bargaining power. So it's both the cause for the policies, but it's also what's constraining, in my mind, the policies from getting too extreme, because the countries need each other too badly. So the European Union actually started after World War II with the steel and coal agreement in Europe. And in the documentation for that agreement, it was written that they were doing it to make it not only less likely to have a war again, but to make it materially impossible. And there's a big debate in trade after what happened with Russia and with what's happening with China, whether trade actually prevents you from going to war because you're too dependent on each other, or in the case of US and China now, or Russia and Europe, it makes war so much more damaging because you're dependent on each other. So, it's exactly what's causing the problem, but it's also, in some extent, what's constraining it now. So in a way, the decoupling that's happening, even though it's gradual, if it continues and gets past a point where we don't need each other, that might be the point where things actually get worse. But those are extremely important points.
Maybe we have time for one more question.
Can we talk about soybeans for a moment? Soybeans and like products like soybeans. What we're currently faced with, as you know, is China says, I'm not buying any more soybeans. We now have a lot of soybeans growing in the Midwest and upper Midwest, et cetera. The response from the administration is, okay, we'll pay the farmers for the products that they can't sell. Can we afford that? I mean, how much is that going to cost? And if you play it out, because that goes in a sense to one of the core bases of our current president. That's where his staunch supporters are. So the simple question is, Trump thinks he can buy his way out of it. Maybe. Can he?
Yeah, I think he can. And I mean, it depends how carefully they do it. So what you can do is, there are ways of purchasing that encourage diversification of those crops, support in the short run, and if it doesn't spread to other sectors, there's a lot of tariff revenue coming in, so it can certainly be supported. So I think it's possible And that's really the main leverage China has on the U.S. is the soybeans. I think they also do want those soybeans and don't want to be overly dependent on Brazil. So again, these are places where I see an agreement more likely is soybeans, rare earths, TikTok, some small agreements around specific things. But we can't afford that. It's a matter of whether it spreads to start trying to support everyone who starts asking. And if it spreads, it gets a lot more difficult. But with agriculture, we've been doing it since forever. Europe's been doing it since forever. So there's just always been this kind of, when times are tough, we give handouts for agriculture because you can't turn on a dime.
Dean Freund, thank you very much for delivering this year's Peterson Lecture.
Thank you, and those were great questions. Thank you.
We have a reception in the back of the room. Please join us.